start?
Yeah, it should.
Yeah, I can see the live seconds ticking off now. Yeah.
Okay, I can see it now.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my brothers and sisters. Welcome tonight to the next session of National Zakat Foundation in the series of events and lectures we are doing online in relation to different aspects of the well-being of our Muslim community. And tonight we have a topic that we haven't touched on before, and that's related to men's mental health. Alhamdulillah, we have an esteemed guest, Brother Tareq Ahmed, who is the director and co-founder of EducAid. EducAid, it actually stands for education and aid of mental health, specifically dealing with the male side of this particular mental discussion that we're going to have tonight. So I will let Tareq introduce himself and explain a bit about what they do and how they deal with stuff, and then we'll go into specific questions. He will be talking about as well taking control over your own mental health, looking out for a mate, and he will be sharing with us a personal story of his as well. And as usual, we'll be taking some questions from the audience, and I also have some few questions that I've always been pondering over. An example, what's the difference between anxiety and depression, etc., etc. So we'll cover all of those tonight, inshallah. So without further ado, let's get our beloved esteemed companion and brother Tareq.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you, National Zakat Fund, for having us on board to discuss such an important and pertinent issue that our community and all general communities face. So EducAid Australia was founded in 2018. And our main goal and objective is to be able to speak about issues around mental health, mental illness, destigmatize the conversation and discussion around mental health and mental illness, and sort of smash the taboo surrounding this topic. So it was actually a group of us. I was approached by a close friend. His name is Ziad, who's the CEO and also co-founder of EducAid, and we both have our unique stories around why we decided to sort of work together to build EducAid and educate communities around mental illness. So Ziad has his own story. So he worked with as a teacher, and he's worked with youth, and he's realized that there's a gap within the community in regards to mental illness and the ability to respond to such situations. And he realized that he loved teaching. So he approached me, knowing that I'm an individual who has gone through my own battle with mental illness. So I went through my own bouts with severe anxiety, severe depression, and suicidal ideation. And now I share my journey about what I've been through, and also how I've come out through the other side through treatment and the battle that I had to go through to get to where I am today. So just briefly, I think it's really important to differentiate between what mental health is and what mental illness is. So mental health is usually revolving around our psychological, social, emotional, behavioral well-being, whereas mental illness refers to when there is an impairment. There are severe changes in a person's behavior, thoughts, and emotions, where it impairs functioning, and it's usually persistent over time. So usually you'll hear things about, this person's depressed. that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a major depressive disorder, or you might hear that this person has anxiety. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a mental illness either, right? So it's really important that we differentiate between the two concepts and ideas. So I'd like to start by, speaking about taking control of your own mental health. And this is something that I encourage most people. I encourage most people to do, which is educate yourself around mental illness, what constitutes a mental illness, the different types of mental illnesses that are present in the world, such as depression, such as anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, autism, etc. And learn to identify the signs and symptoms that cause the signs and symptoms surrounding these mental illnesses, so that we are better able to help individuals. Better yet, sort of try to identify the signs and symptoms of somebody's mental health deteriorating, so we know how to step in and address these issues. So with EducAid, this is something that we do. We teach mental health first aid. It's there's a couple of different courses where we do like a 12-hour over 2 days, where we teach people about mental health, the general mental health. We talk about suicide statistics, and then we start to delve into depression. We start to delve into anxiety, schizophrenia, and drug abuse. And within each topic, we talk about the mental health first aid plan and how to approach an individual, what sort of treatments are available, who they can approach for support, and what to do in certain crisis situations such as suicide. So really, it's being able to identify these symptoms. And I think a couple of good starting points for education would be just the general sort of going to Beyond Blue or the Black Dog Institute. They have a ton of resources surrounding these around mental illness and mental health. We also ourselves create our own content through EducAid, through Facebook, through Instagram and LinkedIn. And we like to share that with individuals. We like to create hope, instill hope in individuals so they can seek that help. So what I mean by taking control of your own mental health is when you start to feel a significant change in your life. So when you start to feel a significant change in your emotions, in your thoughts and your behaviors, and you start to feel low, start to feel that you're not yourself anymore, it's usually a pretty good sign, that there might be something going wrong. There might be something wrong with you. There might be a deteriorating projection in your mental health. And it's really, something to look out for. So keep an eye out on that, right? And make sure we're doing things that benefit and assist us in maintaining a healthy level of mental capacity, so with our emotions and thoughts and behaviors. So if you're not your usual self, there are options and there are opportunities for you to seek the help that you require and that is necessary. So in terms of looking after a mate, these are a few things that I think most of us would like to do. We're just really unsure on how to do it. There's this concept of listen to hear, not to respond. And I think most of us, including myself, are really guilty about that, right? So how do we look out for a mate? So when a friend of ours begins to speak about their problems and their issues, we usually begin to formulate an idea and a response to what they're saying, rather than actually listening to what they have to say about their problem, right? And we need to try to be non-judgmental in these situations. I know it's difficult. There is a lot of stigma and shame around mental illness. There is a lot of uncertainty around what constitutes mental illness. We don't know how to respond to it. What is it? We brush it off, right, as something around weakness, around, it's really simple to be able to just step out of it, change a couple of things and you're good to go. Stop whinging about it. Stop whinging about feeling depressed. Stop whinging about feeling anxious, right? These are very common responses. Pull up your socks. So we need to be non-judgmental. Ask the right questions. When you approach a friend, you need to ask them, is everything okay? I've noticed, you haven't been feeling yourself lately. You're feeling a bit low. You haven't been coming out that often. You haven't been your usual self. What's happening? And encourage them to talk about their thoughts and their emotions, right? Encourage them to seek professional help. And when I say seeking professional help, there are a few options and a few pathways, right? So what we want to do is be able to give that information, right? Give the support and information that's appropriate for the individual. And this usually begins, there are a few different professionals that are able to help, but in this situation, the first point of contact is GP. Speaking to your GP openly and honestly about what you're experiencing, right? So if we are, because usually what we do is we find that it's personal issues with close family and friends, depending on, what they might think about us, right? They might think that, we're this strong individual who carries everybody around, but they don't see what we're really going through internally. So how can I let them down, right? Even though you're crippling on the inside, you're sort of self-destructing, but you just don't know where to go or where to seek your help. So a good point of contact is your GP. Speak to your GP about your problems. You could probably find the GP who specialize a bit more in mental health, but generally speaking, just your general GP will be able to speak to you and create a mental health plan for you. And usually with that mental health plan, you will be eligible to about 10 subsidized sessions, which I can go into a bit further detail later on. So you can visit a psychologist, right? So speak to a general psychologist or speak to a clinical psychologist, or even a psychiatrist can help. So they're a medically trained doctor who has further specialization in the field of mental health. So that's how you can look after a mate. If you see anything different, if you're comfortable enough, speak to them. Find the right time and place to have this conversation with them. So don't approach them for example, if you're in the middle of the mosque, where there's about 100 people surrounding you, don't just approach them and say, in front of everybody. Make sure it's the right time, right place, and you're able to also, dedicate time to listening to them, right? So don't initiate the conversation and just let the conversation go after 5 minutes because you have some sort of commitment. So time and place is really important. And if they don't open up to you, this is where it's really important to be non-judgmental and also offer them the opportunity to speak and advise them that, look, if you do decide, to speak about what you're going through, you have my contact details. Give me a call whenever whenever you're comfortable or ready to speak about this, and then wait for the right opportunity, but don't pressure them into speaking, because this might have some sort of negative consequences in the long run, in the short term and the long term. It might damage your relationship with the individual. So in regards to men's mental health, it's actually quite interesting. Usually men find it so much more difficult to speak about mental illness. And I think I'd probably go into sort of my own personal experiences, all right? And there's some sobering statistics around men's mental health and suicide. And before I begin, so 87% of people who do who do suicide usually have a mental illness. And in Australia, there's roughly about 3,100 people each year who take their own life, right? And 6 out of 8 of those people on average are males, right? And that's a very sobering statistics, right? And so many of this can be avoided if, we have the right support systems in place. If we give people the opportunity to express themselves, express about what they're feeling and what they're going through, right? But why do men find it so much more difficult to speak about mental illness? Well, there are a couple of points, right? There is the conditioning. As a Muslim male, growing up in Western Sydney, we're conditioned in a certain way where we're not encouraged to express how we feel or express pain or emotion. It's usually looked down upon, looked sort of weak. You need to be a strong man, especially at a young age. You hurt yourself, you cry. The usual response from an adult is toughen up, teach him to be a man. So we grow up not knowing how to express our pain. So what we do is we usually bottle this up as we get older. And that's actually something that happened through to me at a very young age. I have a very difficult time being able to express myself, express what I'm experiencing through a day-to-day process. And it's something that developed over my teenage years, and it bottled up and it developed into something a bit more serious than what it could have been if I had been encouraged at a very young age to speak about how I felt. There's a stigma around it, right? So the negative attitudes that individuals and communities hold towards mental illness. There's a lot of uncertainty and knowledge. We don't really accept mental illness as a real illness, right? As a real disease that requires attention. It requires medical attention. But there's also the self stigma, and this is something that I experienced myself. I didn't want to accept that I had a mental illness. I didn't want to accept that I had severe anxiety and severe depression, and to the point where I had reached a point of suicide, right? So I was thinking about that. This is what I was thinking about. I was thinking that the only way to stop this from happening was through taking my own life. I didn't reach a point where it eventuated, right? But that's where I reached a point of where the anxiety stemmed so deep and it became so embedded inside of me that I didn't know how to get it to stop, right? It's not something that you just sort of snap out of. It's not something that you just stop worrying, right? It's out of your control to a point. There are neurological changes that happen in individuals' body which adapts, happens in their brain, and they start to adapt to a standard of anxiety. Right? There's the fear, right? We're just afraid. We want to make sure that we have this strong persona around, strong persona for our family, for our wives, for our children, for our parents. You know, at times we try to hold it for them, right? So we're afraid to speak up and open up about it. And then there is also, we're not sure, right? And this is really, really interesting, because for years I wasn't actually sure what I was experiencing. I didn't know that I had severe anxiety and severe depression, right? I had a really bad stomach. So like my stomach was churning on a daily basis. I started to have really poor sleep hygiene, poor sleep. I was feeling fatigued every day. I dragged myself day to day to work, to see family, to see friends, but it took every ounce of energy for me to see it. I even went to a stage where I spoke to a religious figure, and they said, just read Ruqya. And obviously there is benefit in Ruqya in our religion, but it's about understanding when the appropriate help is required. If somebody comes with the flu, we go to see a doctor, right? If somebody has cancer, we visit the doctor and we speak and we determine what the right mode of intervention is necessary to deal with this illness. And it's very, very similar with mental illness. We just don't view it that way. And it's a way that we should be viewing it, right? As a legitimate illness. There's tons and decades of research around anxiety, around depression, around post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma that we carry at a very young age. It's a reality. It exists. It's not something that you can say that it doesn't exist and cover your eyes and turn around. And this is it, right? And when we do that, this is what happens with our statistics around suicide. People, have nowhere to turn because they're not sure who to talk to in this situation. You want to talk to your family, but there's stigma, there's negative attitudes towards mental illness. You want to turn to your community, but again, snap out of it. What is there for you to be so depressed about? Why are you so anxious? Why are you so sad? Why are you so stressed? You're living in Australia, you're living in a first world country. There's nothing that you should be worried about. And it's a very narrow, myopic view, in my opinion, right? To understand how complex mental health is and complex our relationships with everyone around us. It's not as simple as to say that. And there's also about, so, I spoke about stigma, I spoke about shame, fear, uncertainty, not knowing, where to seek help. So I think it's a good time for me to step in. So there are, So for me, looking in hindsight, I began to develop a lot of signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression from a very young age, okay? But it only really started to eventuate and express itself at a very young, at sort of my early 20s, after a few stressful factors. So as an individual, I had negative ruminating thoughts for a very long time and nowhere to express them, right? I had broken relationships with people that were really close to me, right? I had very low self-esteem. So I had very low self-esteem. And actually one of the determining factors for sort of the turning points in my journey was I was sitting with a friend who also does life coaching and said, Tareq, please, I want you to write on a piece of paper what you think about yourself. Right? I just want you to be honest and open. So I thought, you know what, nothing's worked up until this point. Let me try to do this honestly. So I wrote this piece of paper, and it's something that I posted on the EducAid page. I've written down what that piece of paper has. So if you visit the EducAid page, you can see what I've written on that. So halfway through this page, I've realized this list isn't ending. So after I was finished with the list, it was like a page and a half, He asked me, read it out loud to me. So as I went 3 to 4 lines down into what I thought about myself, I started crying, right, in the middle of a cafe in Guildford. And I realized I am one of like my worst enemies, right? I really dislike myself. So how can an individual be mentally healthy if they dislike themselves? That's only one part of the many different aspects around mental illness, right? Then I also had to work on my relationship with my father, which was broken from a very young age. I went through a lot of work through that, right? So I started to really start to open up. I visited my GP. I spoke to my GP. I'm like, look, I need to speak to somebody, and I need to speak to somebody as soon as possible. All right. So I received a referral for a psychologist out east, right? And this psychologist really tested me, made me sort of push me to my limits to try to understand what I'm experiencing and how I'm experiencing, and I broke, right? Then I started to sort of repair the relationships in my life, started to work through cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So it's the idea that our thoughts affect our emotions and our emotions affect our behavior. And it's a cycle that starts to develop over a very long time, and it just becomes embedded into who we are. So then your standard mode, right? Your default mode is to feel anxious and down all the time. And then I repaired those relationships, but it did reach a point where I was experiencing severe neurotic symptoms for years. So my brain adapted to that mode of thought, and I thought, look, this needs medical intervention. There is so much stigma and uncertainty or animosity towards medication, around medication in mental illness. I wasn't sure whether this is something that I wanted to take, right? But I did have a conversation with my GP, but I spoke to my friend and he said, look, can it be any worse than what you're experiencing right now? And I thought about it and I took the medication, and I'm glad that I did take the medication because it made significant differences in my life. It gave me that boost that I needed to see that it's okay, I can get through this. And eventually I did get through this. And this is where my journey has led me to here, right? This is what I'm doing with EducAid Australia. Right? I get up and I talk about this proudly and I talk about this confidently because it's something I do want to share with others. I'm not special in any way, shape, or form, but I know my story. There are so many people out there, especially males, even if it is males, whether it's females, regardless of race, religion, background. I want to encourage that change. I want to inspire people to seek the help, educate themselves about mental illness, speak to their GPs, visit their psychologist, visit a psychiatrist. I just think when we speak about physical illnesses, we're willing to give many doctors a go, right? So if one doctor doesn't do their job well, then what we do is we visit another doctor. And then if that doctor doesn't do their job well, then we visit another doctor, and we keep going until we find a solution. Whereas with mental illness, I find that when we visit one psychologist and that psychologist, it doesn't work well, then we tend to sort of blame the entire industry, right? We sort of try to blame the entire discipline around mental health and psychology. If one psychologist doesn't work, then then visit the next psychologist. All right. So I have a question from Farouk. Could you shed some light on the difference between a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a clinical psychologist? All right. So with a psychiatrist, they are medically trained doctors. So they go through the same process as other, doctors. But what they have to go through after their 6 years is a 4 to 5 year specialization in mental illness. They can prescribe medications. Psychiatrists are allowed to prescribe medication. Whereas with a psychologist and a clinical psychologist, so really a psychologist, you do 4 to 6, so you got 6 years, and you can register as a general psychologist. I won't go into the nitty gritty. Clinical psychologists have a further specialization in mental illness, but they are not allowed to prescribe medication. They are not medically trained doctors. They are trained in talk therapies, so cognitive behavior therapies. They are trained in interpersonal therapies, behavior therapy, acceptance, commitment therapy. So there are different types of therapies that you can get through the psychologist. So the easiest way to remember this is psychiatrists are medically trained doctors who specialize in mental illness, who can prescribe medication. Psychologists are specialized in talk therapies, and they are not allowed to prescribe medication. So those are the differences. So you do have those at your disposal for your use. If you would like to access a psychologist, I highly recommend, and usually not many people know about this pathway. Speak to your to your local GP, ask them to write you up a mental health plan, and through that you are entitled to a subsidized fee. A subsidized fee to visit your psychologist. So for a general psychologist, it usually covers the cost. For a clinical psychologist, which I mentioned, they specialize a bit further for a couple of years. It covers a significant chunk of the amount of money that you'll have to pay for visiting a psych. So I think it's sad that sometimes, I think within our community as well, we try to downplay the presence of mental illness, right? We try to sort of deflect and think, all right, 1 in 5 Australians can be diagnosed or fit the diagnosis for a mental illness in any given year. But I've heard this many times over and over where we're told, our community doesn't have those. We have our religion, and if you abide by that, then you can't develop a mental illness. It's a very short-sighted view. It's not if somebody were to approach you with a disease such as cancer, or they have Alzheimer's, or cerebral palsy, or multiple sclerosis, you would not tell them that. This is very similar, again, with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. There are neurobiological changes in the individual's brain. There are occur internally, right? And the risk factors around mental illness can be tenfold. Sorry, there are numerous risk factors around why somebody develops a mental illness. I'll just fix this. It's a bit low. Yeah, there are many factors around why, and those include social factors, right? So this includes our relationships with our friends, our families. I think we underestimate how much our presence can affect another individual in our family. We might think we're doing what's right for them as individuals. Sometimes we overstep our boundaries as parents. We overstep our boundaries as children. We overstep our boundaries, as friends. We need to understand and respect boundaries regardless of what our relationships are with others. Sometimes we don't realize that we put that pressure. And I think we're sort of like disconnected, although we're so much more disconnected in this day and age. I feel like, we're a lot more isolated as individuals. We don't talk deeply enough. We don't have those honest conversations with each other. We're just afraid to open up, at the fear of being ridiculed and stigmatized and shamed for what we experience. And I think it's really important we do start to have these conversations with our family members. I went years on my own without realizing that I have a problem. But eventually I got through my family. I've got through to my parents, my brothers and sisters, and my wife, who supported me throughout the way. And it became so much better for me. And it's so much easier. It opened up the path for me to be able to recover, right? And that's not something that's easy, right? And I commend them for changing their perspective and their understanding around that. And I'm grateful for that. There are other factors like biological, right? So I mentioned neurobiological. There are changes in the way our brain structure. It can be genetic. And it can also be there's psychological, and there's also psychological, right? The way we think, the way we process information. So negative rumination. So I have a comment here. It says, a problem in our community is that stigma that you have a lack of iman if you are suffering from mental illness. Yeah, look, I've heard that a few times, right? I really have. But again, I think it's a very, short-sighted view. We need to look at, and this is actually a conversation that I've spoken to about with our mashayikh, right? During one of our courses with Anik, and they agreed it can be detrimental, because we've had, me, myself, and EducAid, we've had people approach us who, said that they are extremely, religious. They pray there 5 times. They have severe anxiety, severe depression, because there are actual changes happening inside the individual's brain, right? It's for us to say that mental illness is only because lacking iman. Then what we do is we negate all the other external factors, right? What about people who suffer from, physical abuse, the people who suffer from emotional abuse, sexual abuse, growing up as children, and they have a higher risk factor for developing a mental illness, right? What about people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who grow up without parents to guide them? People who not only have experienced abuse, but I know of a few people who have developed it over time because of those experiences, the trauma that they've experienced from a young age. People underestimate the power of our relationships with our parents. And the way we address it, I think sometimes from a religious perspective, growing up, I had a really bad relationship. It wasn't bad, it was sort of like a non-existent relationship with my father. And every time I'd attend a talk and about birrul walidain, which is really important, right? It's about ensuring that we have that dutifulness, obedience to our parents, but it never really addresses the core issue. How do we address the core issue between our family? How do we address the core issue between family members, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, etc.? It's not always just about staying patient. We're not just taught to be patient for the rest of our lives. If you have an issue, we're taught to face it. Tie your camel, and then do what you need to do. We need to make sure that we put the right, controls in place. We need to take the right steps in order to seek that help. If you have, for example, if you're unfit, you're overweight, you just sit there and just sort of hope for you to lose weight. No, you go out there and you do something about it. Same thing with health, right? If you're diagnosed with an illness, a physical illness, for example, you have a flu, what do? You just sort of, if you have a flu or a fever, or if you have a broken leg, do you just sort of sit on the couch and wait for this leg to heal itself? No, you go visit a medical doctor. It's a very similar concept and idea that we're sort of trying to get through. There is decades of research backing the changes in the individual, the physiological changes in the individual, the neurobiological changes in an individual's life that has an effect on them. It's liberating to be able to identify, that, okay, I'm developing a mental health problem and I should seek help now. It's so important to be able to have early intervention in a when somebody is developing a mental illness, right? The more delayed a mental illness takes before it's diagnosed, the worse the outcome is for the individual, right? The majority of mental illness can be treated, right? Some a bit more complicated, like for example, schizophrenia or bipolar, they require medical intervention and they might require medication for a really long time. But nonetheless, there is hope, right? There is so much hope around seeking the necessary help you need. You're not feeling well, you're not comfortable speaking with family and friends, speak to your GP. They're bound by confidentiality and privacy. Speak to your psychologist. They are also bound by the code of ethics that they do not breach privacy and confidentiality unless there is harm for the individual or for others. Otherwise, they are bound by that. Have that open, honest conversation with them. Go to your doctor. Speak to them about medication. Speak to them about what your options are. If you're afraid about it, they can educate you about, what some of the side effects. I have a question here. Can you address anxiety and panic attacks, please? Look, it's a very, very broad question, right? So anxiety, we all experience some level of anxiety to a degree, like as individuals. It's an emotional state. When we're extremely under pressure to be able to, deliver something, or for example, I'm overly overwhelmed. There's a bit of fear, a bit of worry. That's anxiety, right? That's something that we will always face, the fear of sort of the unknown. Whereas an anxiety disorder, it becomes a disorder when you meet a certain criteria, right? It's like a diagnosis through the DSM. You have to have experienced a few symptoms. It's like sort of a psychologist or a GP or psychiatrist can go through that and determine if you are suffering from an anxiety disorder, right? So it's persistent, it impairs your functioning, it impairs your ability, right? It impairs your ability physically, it impairs your ability physically, emotionally, socially, right? So you won't be able to go out anymore like you'd like to. You feel sort of scared, shaky, anxious all the time. Your ability to socialize with people, go to work. From my experience, don't feel embarrassed and scared to come out to the right people, right? Find somebody that you can talk to. And this is what we're trying to do with EducAid. We're trying to educate people around mental illness, what constitutes a mental illness, what their options are, and there are options. There is stigma around it, and it's something that I had to go through, right, as I worked through my anxiety disorder. But I'm glad that I went through my GP. I spoke to my psychologist. It's great when you're able to walk into a room, close the door behind you, and know that as long as obviously you're not at risk or other people aren't at risk of being hurt, to be able to speak your mind freely, right? I know it might be uncomfortable for individuals to speak to their partners, their wives, their husbands, their parents, right? So, which is usually why I think it's a good option to be able to speak to a psychologist. Sometimes we need to get this stuff out. We need to get it out of our mind. And I really highly encourage, look, it might be uncomfortable initially, right? It might invoke some sort of anxiety, as ironic as that might sound. It might be a bit anxiety provoking for you to start to speak about it with your psychologist to begin with. But I promise you there's hope. There's ways around this, you know. I wouldn't say that I lost a few years of my life, you know, trying to work through this, because I think that for me, it made me, you know, it made me who I am, you know. It sort of guided me. I was studying my master's in political economy, and, you know, I really wanted to make a change in the world. And then when I went through what I went through, I wanted to learn more about it. And I had severe anxiety while I was studying my degree in psychology, and I am still studying it at the moment. But I'm glad I went through it, so that now it shaped me and directed me into being able to inspire others. And this is what we want to try to do, especially with EducAid, right? We work in schools, we work in communities, and we're, you know, trying to work on our own curriculum and our own programs that we can roll out, you know, potentially look into opening support groups. But I think it's really important to distinguish that we're not therapists, right? And this is why I won't respond to anything sort of specific. We always encourage individuals to seek the necessary professional help. Speak to your GP, speak to your psychologist, and speak, you know, get a referral for a psychiatrist if necessary. Speak to them about the effects of medication, why you're not comfortable about it, and they can address any of the concerns if you have. There are so many medications out there that can support you. And for me, if it wasn't for them, I would never have known that I had a problem, right? So when my psychologist stared at me, there were moments of catharsis, right? So that emotional release that you're craving. I think nothing is more painful than having the inability to feel what you're supposed to feel in a happy situation, you know, in a sad situation, in a confusing situation. So when I went through my anxiety and depression, I became so emotionally numb that it was so difficult for me to cry. You know, I was in so much pain internally. I just didn't know where to go. So I'd escape to my bedroom and try to sleep it off. And when I sleep, I'd wake up feeling more exhausted than I was the day before. And it was a never-ending cycle. And I felt like there was no hope. I really, truly did. And that's what happens when we lose all hope and we lose the ability to know that there is support out there. It can lead us down a really dark rabbit hole, right? A really dark path. And that's when these are where the sobering statistics are. You know, over 3,000 people in Australia. You know, our community is not immune to mental illness. Our community is not immune to suicide. You know, if we open our minds, open our hearts, learn more about mental illness, accept mental illness for what it is, you know, create networks where we can refer each other to psychologists and professionals that people are comfortable with, how amazing would that be? You know, how amazing would it be to have somewhere to be able to go when we're feeling down, feeling low, connect people and support? How amazing would it be to, you know, connect families again together, you know, to open up our ability to, you know, accept each other for who we are and move forward that way, rather and then sort of destroy any ego that comes along the way, you know, preconceived ideas of what should and shouldn't be. You know, try to get across these cultural limitations, you know, cultural barriers, and even religious understandings around. It's not religious understandings, and I've had this conversation during our ANIC mental health first aid, and it was fantastic. You know, it was really amazing, because I had some imams, some communities speak to me and say, you know, where can we go? Like, you know, there are people that approach us, and we know that it's outside of our expertise, it's outside of our zone. So who can we speak to? And we recommend, you know, some psychology clinics. We recommend, you know, them visiting their GP, their usual avenues, you know, speaking to community organization for that help. And if it wasn't for me going through those avenues, I would have never known that I had an issue. If I did not speak to that friend who was non-judgmental, you know, that friend that accepted me with his open arms, asked me to be honest with myself, where would I be today? You know, and that opened the doors. I spoke to my partner, my wife, who's my wife now, who was my fiance back then. You know, where would I be if she didn't open up and accept me for who I am? You know, where would I be if I didn't visit the GP and the GP provide me with a mental health plan, and then go to the psychologist who then diagnosed me and told me, look, you have a serious problem. I think you have, you know, severe depression, anxiety-based depression. Maybe look into medication. I was afraid, but I went through the medication and it helped me. It gave me that step up. I learned so much about changing my life, you know, changing my diet, trying to maintain exercise, you know, to maintain that mental health and addressing the underlying cause and the underlying issues.
Tareq, just in that point there, I visited a very dear friend today, and they mentioned about, and they also, the person's going through depression, anxiety, and the family's trying to help. But the worry that they mentioned was that, you know, they're always reluctant from the doctors prescribing medication, and you know, the worry of the side effects and how long the medication. If you're taking medication for a long time, is it good, etc., etc. So how did you find that? It's just when the psychologist told you to take medication, did you accept it immediately? How long does it take to work?
All right, so it wasn't a psychologist that prescribed it, but he did recommend speaking to my GP, because the psychologist can't prescribe it. But he did he did say, I recommend you might look into it, speak to your GP about it, which I do recommend to everybody. I did look at the packet. I won't lie to you. I bought the medication. I stared at it. My wife was sort of reluctant for it. My friend looked at me. I told him, look, man, I'm not sure. Some of these side effects sound they sound a bit tough, you know, like. And then he actually looked at me and said, can it, like, really, where to from here? And he was right. I was in a really bad place. And just briefly, as I was doing my research around, like, you know, sort of just anything that they sort of experience or witness during a trial as a side effect, they'll put it on the piece of paper, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you will experience those side effects, right? You might experience one or two. You might experience a few more than that. But this is why it's really important to have this conversation with your doctor, right? Speak to him about the side effects. Each medication is different depending on the individual. Some might take 2 weeks to take effect. Some might take longer. I was really worried about the medication being of a high dosage. So my doctor recommended, what about we put you on a low dose and see how you respond to that, right? And I did. And look, it did have some side effects, which I probably won't get into. They're a bit personal. But look, I did have a couple of side effects, but nothing that was to the extent that, like, you know, there's a fear and the stigma around it, that I had preconceived ideas, right? I had a set of ideas about what medication does to individuals, but this is where it is. You got to work closely with your medical professional around antidepressants. But again, antidepressants, for me personally, it's really important to do that alongside with therapy, right? With speaking to a psychologist, because the medication can do one thing, but if you don't change some habits, if you don't change some thought processes and behaviors, once you sort of wean yourself off the medication, then you might find yourself falling back into some of those habits that developed in the first place. So that's what I did. I worked side by side with medication. If you don't, you know, if you're finding that the medication is giving you some headaches, because that was some of my my side effects. I had some headaches. I felt a bit nauseous at times, but overall, the benefit outweighed the potential harm that people might perceive. But it helped me. It really did.
So that's key to it, right? Is that final result? Like, I mean, but if you pondered and wondered and never took the medication, you might not be here today to tell your story. And that's what people need to look at. And also from a GP perspective, many people, like, often I've seen some really hopeless general practitioners. You go in and they basically don't have time. They're so busy. They're working in these clinics where they just turn people over and over. So one of the suggestions is that if you feel your GP is not good enough in caring and having taken the time to sit and listen to your conversation, then change your GP, right?
Yeah, that's right. Change your GP. You know, this is what I mentioned. Like when it comes to physical health, right? We'll change GPs. It's not an issue. You know, this GP is not good, I'm going to go to my next GP. If I go, this one's not good, I'm going to go to the next one. When it comes to mental illness, if we have one sort of mixed up, you know, mishap throughout the process, we sort of disregard the whole process. Like, no, it's not good enough. I don't want to visit another GP. I don't want to visit another psychologist. you know. But you mentioned it, you know, if it wasn't for that medication, I don't think I'd be here today. I really don't. The reason I say that is because, sorry, I speak about this, I get a bit emotional. Really, people underestimate the effects of a mental illness. It's not easy, you know, to wake up on a daily basis feeling like your life is sort of non-existent. You know, it's sort of dragging along. You have no energy. Like there is almost absolutely nothing inside of you to give. You know, you wake up, you go to sleep, you dream for 9 hours straight. You wake up about 10 times a night, broken sleep, your cortisol levels through the roof. You know, you feel pain and tightness across your entire body. You feel tightness in your shoulders, in your neck. You feel tightness in your back, and you're trying, you know, you're changing your diet, you know, and you're trying to physically exercise. I was a power lifter during that time, right? And as a power lifter, I was competing in competitions, you know, and this also contributed to my depression and anxiety when I injured my lower back, right? So I tore a muscle in my lower back during a competition with 265 kilos on my back. I came out of it, continued the competition, but it really, really did suck the life out of me. And, you know, being immobilized, and you're trying to return to it, but your body, the mechanism which produces that energy is not firing, right? So it's not like it's not laziness, right? I know what laziness was. I was a teen. I understand what the lazy process is. This isn't the lazy process. This is your body not operating optimally, right? This is your body not operating like it should be operating. So I tried to return. I really did. I tried my best. You know, I was trying to fix my diet. I was trying to physically activate myself. I was trying to socialize and trying to fix my sleep, but it just felt like there was no hope. You know, it felt like there was no escape for this. You know, one step forward, 20 steps back. And that's really demotivating, right? It discourages you from moving forward. But then when you start to address these problems, you know, and this is why mental health isn't just, you know, a broad concept. You know, we're talking about our emotional health, you know, being emotionally available, responding accordingly. You know, when you find out somebody close to you has passed away, do you know how painful it is to not be able to cry? Although deep down, you feel like there's something boiling, right? It's brewing, and then it disappears. And then you just feel tense and tight, you know. It's also referring to psychological well-being, you know, your social well-being, you know, withdrawing from your family and your friends. It's not that you don't want to talk to them, it's you're not capable of doing it. You know, it's extremely stressful, especially for people with social anxiety, right? Severe social anxiety, to be able to sit around and maintain a conversation for 10, 15, 20 minutes, right? When your mental health is deteriorating and you have a mental illness, it can affect so many aspects in your life. It can affect the way you perform at work. Do you know how difficult it is to stare at somebody and have a conversation with them and absorb nothing? You have an inability to concentrate on what they're trying to say. It affects your memory, right? It affects your cognitive performance. And to a certain extent, it also affects, pardon me here, but even an individual's sexual life, right? It really interferes. Your body is not functioning. It's pretty much reserving all the energy that it has to focus and fight with this anxiety, to fight with this depression. And that's the way it felt. All the energy that I could muster up was just to deal with this anxiety. And a mental illness can have an effect on partnerships, right? Relationships with individuals, you know, married couples not being able to navigate through it. You know, we're afraid to say that, you know, we're unable to consummate, for example, or, you know, we're unable to have a healthy, you know, life together as individuals, an intimate life together. We'd rather, you know, like, and that's for me. So many people find that it's much easier to say, oh, I don't have a problem. I'm just, you know, let's sort of not talk about this, rather than actually talk about what's actually happening to individuals. And as somebody who's, as somebody who around me, my family and my wife and my partner had to experience, it's not easy on them either, you know, and that's something I'd like to, you know, really acknowledge people who go through mental illness and those around them who want to support their family, because it takes a lot of work, you know, it takes a lot of energy, and sometimes that sort of difficulty to be able to deal with me as an individual would be passed on into them, and that's very noticeable in their eyes, right? And then you see that, and you see how exhausted they are trying to help you, so you feel a bit worse deep down and internally about, why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. But for me, I'm glad I went through this, right? It made me into the person I am, right? A better version of myself. And it's something that I still deal with occasionally. Every once in a while, I do feel a bit low, I feel a bit anxious, but that's fine, right? We all do to a certain extent. It's gone beyond. It's no longer an anxiety disorder. It's no longer a depressive disorder. Now it's sort of try to deal with some of the residual symptoms that stay along afterwards, trying to, work with the thoughts and ideas that we have, that can be negative, right? That can be detrimental to ourselves. But I'll give you an example of how I dealt with my anxiety. And this is sort of like cognitive. Whenever I'd have a bad day, I'd feel so upset about having that bad day that it'd make me feel even worse than what I felt initially, right? Because I think for 4 or 5 years where I had really poor sleep, right? And when we have very poor sleep, that can affect our life in so many factors, in so many facets that we don't realize. So when I'd wake up with really sort of tense shoulders, tight neck, and just sort of frustrated, fuzzy, clogged up brain, unable to think, unable to sort of process information. I don't want to talk to anybody. And then I'd feel angry about that, right? This isn't in my control at this point, right? So I've just woken up. This isn't like, people like just, snap out of it. No, I have just woken up and I'm experiencing this. I've just slept and I'm, throughout my sleep, I'm thinking, worrying. And that's, a core part of anxiety, the fear and the worry that somebody has to keep in mind, like that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I have a question here from Shafraz Ali. Are there signs we should look out for so we can try to help others? Is there an organization where people can be trained to pick up the early signs? All right. So generally speaking, I recommended this. I'm not sure if you caught this earlier in the podcast, on the online discussion. I spoke about, Beyond Blue has some really good information, and the Black Dog Institute. Go online, have a read about mental illness, have a read about the statistics in suicide, have a read about what constitutes, a depressive disorder. What are the symptoms and signs to look out for? Anxiety, these are the things. Bipolar, look out for these signs. There are organizations, and that's something that we do, right, with EducAid. We run courses, mental health first aid. So it's a course developed by Mental Health First Aid Australia, and myself, and my friend Ziad, we're both trained, qualified instructors. We run the standard mental health first aid for adults. We do the youth mental health first aid for adults dealing with youth. And they go respectively, one for 12 hours, one for 13 hours. Over 2 days, we do them. And in this course, it provides the general information, right? General information around mental illness. What is mental health? What is mental illness? What is mental health first aid? We talk about, some of the suicide statistics. We talk about, we train individuals on how they can respond, to individuals who are developing signs and symptoms of mental illness. But we also talk about what these signs and symptoms are, right? We talk about this in depth for anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and substance use disorder. So the two most common mental illnesses in Australia are anxiety and depression, right? And usually you'll find that the statistics suggest that women are more likely to be diagnosed with one of the other disorders, but there are a few factors to take into consideration, such as men are less likely to actually accept that they might have a mental illness. They're less, they grudgingly sort of reluctantly accept that, I might have depression, anxiety. There is no shame in having a mental illness. There is no shame in, what you're going through. And, I say this wholeheartedly. I want people to go out there and, to speak to the necessary professionals. I want families to evolve and grow and educate. We want to grow people. We want to impact communities with what we do. We want you to change the way we approach a situation. It's time to, let down our guard, let down our defenses as individuals, as families, for those with mental illnesses. So when somebody does approach us within our family, whether it's our mothers, our fathers, I've seen individuals who in their late 40s, late 50s, even in their 30s, who show some signs, around, developing some sort of anxiety and fear, people who have disturbed thoughts, or, the interrupted sleeping patterns, sleep hygiene, changes in their appetite, in their mood, lack of interest in what you do. And I noticed this, but we won't accept it, right? As we mentioned, there are many factors around why these exist. And if you are interested, we do release these courses every once in a while. We've received funding to roll out courses across, across schools, community organizations. We've run one with ANIC. We're hoping to run another one. We would like to equip leaders. We would like to equip people in families. We'd like to work with workplaces. How do we train people, to be able to deal with these situations? Is there a risk of addiction to medication? Are there steps to overcome this? This will be a question for your GP. This is something that you would actually have to discuss with them. I am aware that there are some anxiety medications that might have that effect, but this is out of my field. So please speak to your GP. And this is what I mean about, it's maybe sometimes we might have to step out of our comfort zone, right? This is it. Don't think that the journey is going to be a simple journey. If you have anxiety, if you have a depression, if you have mental illness, you've come this far. It's time to. It might make you a bit more uncomfortable, but this is the step to recovery, right? This is the step to be able to live the life that you live your life to its fullest potential, right? And this is for me why I wanted to do it. I could never give up, because I know I have so much potential that I can grow into. It's just. And I found the way to do that. And this is the way that I'm sharing with everybody else. Go through your GP as your first point of contact. Speak to your psychologist, families, mothers, fathers, try to change your approach. The old cultural approach of mental illness doesn't exist. Toughen up, pull your socks up. You're just lazy. You can't get anything done. It's time to put that aside. It's time to change our attitude. It's time to change our perspectives on mental illness and mental health.
Brother Tareq, that's just amazing. And just to add on and to make the changes, as we said earlier, if the GP is not helpful, change the GP. And if you go to the Imam and he tells you to your lack of Iman, then change your Imam as well. Because there's so many comments, beautiful comments there, where everybody feels there's such a big need for this type of subject and for the community to do more. Hence why we at National Zakat Foundation are doing a lot of these programs now, that deals with the welfare and well-being of our community. And we're not going to duplicate any of the programs and stuff. We will probably get in touch with you again to run some of those programs for us as National Zakat Foundation. And some of the cases and things that we see in our day-to-day work is that we see brothers come in who's just lost their jobs, and he's the breadwinner. He's struggling to pay the bills. He's even embarrassed to talk to us, even though he's Zakat eligible. And then we see the anxiety building up, and that's a start of things just regressing, so to speak, right? And then next time we see him, things just got worse. They get into more debt. And what we're trying to do, if we see the early signs and understand this, we need to say, okay, brother, besides giving him some help on finances, besides giving him some help on how to budget better, besides giving him some help on how to find another job, we would like to identify, hey, this guy is reaching a point of anxiety where he needs a different type of help, because once he goes down that path, as you know, it could be a while before he comes back to that. We've also noticed anxiety and depression, a high percentage amongst the refugees. And obviously that would be understandable, because, we had a talk on refugees the other night, and when you listen to their story, and because we can't also appreciate why they would, the journey they've come through, to get to Australia, and then, all of these things happen. So that's, before we close up, Brother Farouk will show some of the comments and that's come through, and then we'll give you some closing comments, Tareq. I'll read them. So Iman goes up and down as our heart moves, and man is created weak. But Allah, as our faith is strong, and one day we are weak, the next mental illness exists and is real, even if your faith is very strong. This life is a test, it's not a paradise. May Allah give the Ummah strength and compassion to be kind to one another and treat each other with respect and kindness. Ameen. May Allah reward you, brother, in this life, the next. Ameen. And people are very appreciative of you actually sharing your story, Brother Tareq.
You're welcome. Hi, Hanan.
All right, Brother Tareq, do you have any closing comments there you would like to share with our audience? Alhamdulillah, there's a lot of people on there. And though tonight our title is about men's health, but there seems to be quite a lot of sisters on as well. They're concerned about their men in their life. So do you have some closing comments for us?
I think my closing comment would be to, don't lose hope. It's battling through a mental illness is probably one of the most difficult experiences, or if not up in the top 2 difficult experiences that I've had to go through in my life. And I reached a really, really terrible point. I think I reached rock bottom at that point where I lost hope and faith in everything that existed around me. And this is something that you can do to anyone, right? You can do this to the strongest of us, regardless of who you are, where you exist on the socioeconomic spectrum, whether you're wealthy, whether you're poor, whether you're educated or not, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist, whether you're a tradie, whether you're a butcher, an educator, even mental health workers, social workers. None of us are immune to developing, a mental illness and deteriorating mental health. So my closing comments would be, don't lose hope. We can get through this. There are avenues out there. All life is beautiful. Everybody should be treated with respect and dignity. Everyone should be given the opportunity to be able to deal with their problems. And if anything, let tonight be the moment that you make that change. That change to speak to someone, take that moment to open up to a close friend. Speak to a medical professional. Or even make the intention, a plan to approach this. And please, even if you're not the individual that's opening up, so if you're not the person that has the mental illness, but you have people around you, take care of them. Life's too short to keep pushing people away. Life is too short to damage our relationship with our close family and friends because of our ego or our inability or our ignorance around mental illness. I know people mean well, and some people are well-intentioned, but intention's only half the act. Our actions speak volumes. So, keep that in mind when you're talking to somebody with depression, somebody with anxiety, somebody with schizophrenia. Your words can be the determining factor as to why they seek help or not. Negative attitudes can be decisive in whether somebody seeks help or not. So ask yourself next time when you are around somebody, are my ideas, are my thoughts, when I communicate these, is this going to turn somebody away from seeking the necessary help, or is it going to encourage them to speak to a doctor? And, just want to say thank you, National Zakat Fund, for having us, for having myself and EducAid be able to present on this topic. I look forward to working together in the future to run, courses where we can equip individuals in our community to, to deal with these situations and scenarios.
Jazakallah khairan, Tareq. Yes, we will. We'll definitely be in touch and run some programs, and we probably have you on again to talk through some of these things as we learn more about this particular topic, especially in some of the cases we see we might have to see. We generally try to sign up MOUs with organizations that can help us in some of these aspects. And to the next event we're going to have is on Thursday night. Psych Central Sister Hanan Dover is always very helpful and providing us with some of her areas to come up and present. So Thursday night we're going to have Sister Nasrin Hanifi and Sister Mariam Ardati on, because Thursday is World Drug Awareness Day, I think it's called, and we'll talk about the issue of drugs and drug addiction and rehabilitation in our community. So stay tuned for Thursday night at 8 p.m. inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, and we hope you found tonight's session beneficial. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.